The US and UK have fallen out spectacularly over Iran after Donald Trump absolutely demolished PM Keir Starmer. Have a look at this.
This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
Meanwhile, Keir Starmer has released this week an woke ad on Iran talking to European leaders.
Emmanuel, Friedrich, really good to hear from you.
I think we are all concerned about what could happen within the next couple of hours or days.
We weren't involved, as we've made clear, in the strikes.
Emmanuel and Friedrich. I mean, please. Joining me now is Newsweek Senior Editor-at-Large, Josh Hammer. Josh, good to see you as always. Thanks for joining me. What is it with the UK leaders' obsession suddenly with saying, oh, no, we're not involved in the strikes? It's like, of course you weren't. You're a spineless fool. I mean, he is no Churchill, is he?
No, I think that's probably the understatement of the century, frankly. Keir Starmer, currently his approval rating, if you look at the polls there in the UK, he's somewhere between 40 and 50 points underwater. That's not an exaggeration. He is at this point in his prime minister tenure the least popular prime minister in the history of modern British political polling. It's utterly catastrophic, and Labour is going to get absolutely walloped whenever the next election, whether it's scheduled or a snap election, ends up happening. Query who will benefit the most. Personally, I would place my own wager on Nigel Farage and Reform UK there. But no, the UK has been in declining power for a very, very long time. By the way, that makes me upset. I'm actually an Anglophile myself. I'm an American, obviously, but I think that the Western world, the civilized world in general, owes a huge debt of gratitude to the British for all that they gave us for centuries and centuries of the English common law and various modern conceptions of individual liberty and justice and equal protection. A lot of this really does come from the British tradition. But this country is just a shell. It is an absolute shell of what it was. I mean, not even just 400 years ago, but really what it was, as Donald Trump said, during World War II. I mean, Winston Churchill is rolling in his grave, frankly, looking at Keir Starmer right now. Starmer is now trying to do some mop-up business. He's trying to say, okay, maybe you can actually use our bases for some actions when it comes to Iran there. But, I mean, how stupid do you have to be to let your country get completely overrun with jihadists, which tragically is increasingly what the UK has done to itself, not just these Pakistani rape gangs, but also just this harrowing anecdotal footage of all these marches through the streets of London supporting Hamas and this and that there. How dumb do you have to be to willfully subject your own country to that, and then to try to make some moralistic points about how we didn't join the American strike on, oh, wait, yeah, the world's number one state sponsor of the very jihad that we just willfully led in the front door. It's just so totally perverse. Again, as an Anglophile, I take no pride in it, but unfortunately, it's just where we are.
Well, absolutely, and it's very clear that all Keir Starmer is doing is pandering to votes. That's all he wants in certain sections of the community. That is absolutely all that he wants. Now, look, I thought that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he was very strong as well in his commentary. He's hit back at the critics of the strikes. Have a listen.
Let me explain to you guys this in simple English, okay? Iran is run by lunatics, religious fanatic lunatics. They have an ambition to have nuclear weapons. They intend to develop those nuclear weapons behind a program of missiles and drones and terrorism that the world will not be able to touch them for fear of those things. And this is the weakest they've ever been.
How much pressure, Josh, is the administration under to explain the strikes, even though it is just so obvious, as Marco Rubio just said? Donald Trump keeps saying Iran would have been the one to pull the trigger first had they not intervened.
So the polling overall of the American electorate is pretty split. Actually, just before you and I started chatting, Danica, the most recent poll I saw actually had literally a dead heat, 50-50 approve, disapprove on a straight up, thumbs down. Now, Republicans overwhelmingly support this. And by the way, contrary to what you hear from the likes of Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly and folks like that, contrary to that, it's actually self-identified MAGA Republicans who support the strikes at a considerably even higher clip than just normie Republicans there. So the president's base is enthusiastically entirely behind these strikes. Democrats, predictably, are pretty much lining up all their ducks in a row against it there. So that leaves, as is often the case there, the persuadable middle. So I think when you hear from the administration, when you hear from Secretary Rubio, when you hear from Secretary Hegseth, when you hear from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, well, first of all, they're trying to do their jobs, right? I mean, that's the most important thing. They're trying to actually fulfill their tasks as Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But if there's a political spillover there, they're really just trying to play to the middle of the electorate. The thing, though, about Donald Trump, Danica, is I don't think he actually particularly cares about the polling on this issue. He's been very, very consistent on the issue of Iran for a very, very, very long time. In fact, if you look at all the issues that Donald Trump has been outspoken about for decades there, from my vantage point, there's perhaps only one issue that Donald Trump has a longer and more consistent track record on than Iran, and that's the issue of tariffs and trade, where he has been just remarkably consistent for the better part of a half century. But there's this clip circulating over the past 48 hours or so of Donald Trump going on a talk show during the Tehran hostage crisis, when the regime in its infancy then stormed the embassy, the U.S. embassy there in Tehran, seized a lot of hostages for 444 days before Ronald Reagan freed them. And Trump back then, 1980, was essentially complaining that the Jimmy Carter presidency, in this old clip, he complained that they were not using the U.S. military to go in at minimum try to free American hostages, at maximum try to overthrow this tyrannical regime in its then infancy. So he's been very consistent. His very first speech down the Gilded Escalator at Trump Tower in June 2015, people remember it for his comments about the Mexicans and the border and all that there. And that's true. That was the most memorable part. But he also had a line in that very speech about how Iran is a major threat and will never get a nuclear weapon. He's been remarkably consistent there. The only crazy part is that the mullahs apparently didn't believe him. And boy, they found out the hard way that Donald Trump is not bluffing.
Yeah, exactly. They did not suspect that this would ever come. I think you're absolutely spot on. And I really honestly think that if all goes to plan here, this could be one of the best foreign policy achievements in modern history. I mean, what Donald Trump has done here has been extraordinary. We've got to talk about New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. I just think this guy is a real waste of space in that role. He's added his 2 useless cents in. He can't even say whether or not Iran is better off with or without the Ayatollah. Have a look.
And I've also said that while I may be a young mayor, I am old enough to remember the devastating consequences of our country pursuing a war with the intent of regime change in that very same region not that many years ago.
He is dangerous. He is a typical socialist, Josh. The Ayatollah is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and this guy can't even give a straight answer.
So let's not forget that Zohran Mamdani was actually found, and we owe some credit here to an organization called MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute. They actually uncovered this footage of Zohran Mamdani speaking on the very first day of Ramadan at an Iranian regime-linked mosque, a mosque that's actually on all of the FBI watch list because it's been connected to various Iranian regime front groups in the United States. Mamdani chose that mosque in New York City to speak at on the very first day of Ramadan. That was literally just a week and a half ago, give or take. This is a guy who was the founder when he was in college up in Maine. He was the founder of his so-called Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, otherwise known as SJP. SJP is deeply connected to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. It's essentially a Muslim Brotherhood front group organization here. Also has some ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Mamdani's a lunatic. Yeah, he's very glib. He's smooth talking. He's good looking. He knows how to string a sentence together. He's basically Barack Obama 2.0, except he's actually substantially more dangerous. And Barack Obama was pretty dangerous, but Zohran Mamdani is actually much more dangerous, potentially, God forbid, if he gets higher than his current already pretty high perch there, because he's the singular encapsulation of what I refer to and many others refer to as the red-green alliance, of this deeply unholy alliance of convenience between the Marxists on the one hand and the Islamists on the other. He is absolutely a Marxist. He's a guy who has quoted Karl Marx, his Communist Manifesto, to each according to their need. He literally, you go to his Twitter feed, he's been quoting the Communist Manifesto for years there. He also has sympathy to the Iranian regime, as you correctly note, and to various other radical Islamist factions there. A guy who couldn't condemn or even bring himself to distance himself from the genocidal calls to globalize the Intifada. He only withdrew from endorsing that phrase under immense pressure, and he did so basically halfway through his mayoral campaign. So the guy is a subversive fifth column, frankly, in my view. And tragically, he's been elected to lead the nation's most important city there. The only silver lining I have, Danica, is one of my favorite quotes is this notion from H.L. Mencken, the 20th century newspaper columnist, that democracy is a theory that the people know what they want, the common people know what they want, then they deserve to get it good and hard. And they're getting it good and hard in New York. Hopefully they wake up sooner rather than later.
Well, look, you certainly hope so. And let's not forget, I mean, Zohran Mamdani was a rapper, a singer. I mean, he had a list of all these different random jobs, and then suddenly he gets this epiphany that he wants to become mayor. And everything was meant to be free, and suddenly he's, an expert in foreign policy as well. It's just extraordinary. Now, look, Donald Trump has threatened to cut off trade with Spain. So he came out today, he accused the NATO ally of failing to meet defence spending commitments and refusing to allow US forces to use Spanish bases to support operations related to strikes against Iran. I wonder if he'll make good on this threat, Josh. What impact could this have?
Well, he definitely might. Look, this administration takes a fairly skeptical approach towards Western Europe. I think that's been pretty clear. We opened our conversation talking about Keir Starmer and Donald Trump's very harsh words for Keir Starmer. Trump's had very harsh words when it comes at times to Emmanuel Macron in France as well there. And Spain is currently led by a zealous left winger, a guy who has accused Israel of genocide there, who has not particularly nice things to say about the United States and various other Western powers in general there. So no, I think it is absolutely not past Donald Trump to try to impose crippling, potentially tariff sanctions. Who knows? I don't think he particularly cares, frankly, that Spain is in NATO. Why? Because the United States is the ultimate guarantor of NATO. The United States is the ultimate guarantor of essentially all of these invariably semi-feckless to full-on feckless Western transnational institutions there. The United States is the only reason that NATO still exists, that the United Nations still exists, that all these various organizations still exist there. So that's kind of besides the point. And, really the administration's approach towards Europe, which we saw probably at its apex, we saw with these two Munich Security Conference speeches last year from the Vice President J.D. Vance, this year from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, where they both take a very skeptical approach towards Europe. The way to view this is that America is trying to bring Europe back to its glory. America wants Europe to be what it was in the not so distant past. It's pretty ironic, isn't it, that in the aftermath of the joint U.S.-Israeli campaign against the Iranian regime, that pretty much all of the various Arab countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, even Qatar, Iran's erstwhile ally, they all came out in support of the United States and Israel. And it was the UK and France, above all, that were equivocating. Germany was initially equivocating. They seem to have essentially gone in line. But that's a very strange state of affairs, isn't it? Right? Where there's this military campaign against this Muslim country, and the Muslim world is much more supportive than Western Europe. That's not the way it should be there. And I think that's ultimately really kind of deep down what's animating this standoff between the U.S. and Spain as well.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And let's not forget, I mean, Donald Trump's pushed other countries as well to lift their defence spending. He was even pushing for Australia too. So, look, I'll be very interested to see what happens here. Josh Hammer, nice to catch up with you. Thanks very much for joining me on the show.